The smell came first, acrid, thick, impossible to ignore. It crept through the corridors of the vast Escorial palace like a silent warning, clinging to every tapestry, seeping into the velvet and stone. Servants turned pale priests, whispered prayers under their breath, and courtiers covered their noses, pretending not to notice. But they all knew where it came from. Behind heavy doors in a chamber no longer able to mask its decay, the most powerful man in the world. King Philip II of Spain was dying, not fading quietly in his sleep, not falling in battle, but rotting alive in his own flesh. His body was turning against him piece by piece, and still he clung to power. This was not how an emperor was supposed to die. He had ruled one of the largest empires ever assembled, stretching across continents from the cold waters of the Netherlands to the gold-laced jungles of the New World. He was the Catholic king, the most prudent, the man who wielded the sword of God on earth. He had crushed rebellions, launched armadas, married queens. He had watched entire civilizations bend the knee before him. And yet, now confined to a rancid bed and wrapped in bloodied linen, he was reduced to a groaning shadow of his former self. One who begged for death, only to be denied it. Not because heaven had closed its doors to him, but because earth wasn't finished punishing him. There is something grotesquely poetic about a king who once judged heretics by fire, now consumed by an inferno from within. Gangrene, gout, septic ulcers that burst and oozed through his skin, sores so deep the bone showed, the flesh of his legs blackened and curled like burned parchment. His screams pierced the silence of midnight. His fists once used to sign death warrants now clawed at the air in agony. It was not just pain, it was desecration. How does a king reach such an end? Was it punishment, divine irony, or the inevitable collapse of a man who believed he could govern both earth and heaven? Philip II was not born cruel, or perhaps not entirely. He was a child raised in the cold chambers of a Habsburg court, taught that emotion was weakness and silence was strength. He inherited a vision, a united Catholic world under one crown. But in pursuing it, he became something else. Obsessed, rigid, a man who outlived his own hope. A king surrounded by spies, traitors, and shadows. A father who watched his own son die in prison by his command. A ruler who saw enemies everywhere and sometimes created them. And now, at the end, those enemies no longer needed swords. His body had become the executioner, but this is only the surface. Because behind the smell, the screams and the failing flesh lies a deeper story, one of ambition and madness, of divine dreams and human limits. The story of how the world's most powerful man found himself utterly helpless, not by war, not by rebellion, but by the slow, merciless rot that began inside him. What truly killed Philip II? And why did history try to bury the horror of his final days? Let us look closer and step inside the dark room where a king's power ended, not in battle, but in blisters and blood. To understand Philip's death, we must understand his life. Not the legends, not the myth of the Catholic king, but the man himself, his fears, his obsessions, his silence, and above all the unbearable weight of the empire he inherited. Philip was born in 1527, a child of one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, the House of Habsburg. His father, Emperor Charles V, ruled over a domain so vast that it was said the sun never set on it. And one day, that impossible burden would pass to Philip. But Charles did not raise his son with affection. There were no warm embraces, no lullabies sung in golden halls. Instead, Philip was trained like a weapon, shaped to be obedient, cold, calculating. He was tutored in theology and strategy, taught to pray for hours, to mask emotion, to view doubt as sin. Where his father had been a warrior king, charismatic and bold, Philip was molded into something else entirely, a ghost in velvet robes. At 16, he began governing in his father's name. At 20, he was married for diplomacy, not love to a dying Portuguese princess. He barely knew her. She died, giving birth to his son. Philip did not weep. He would marry 3 more times, including Mary Y of England, Bloody Mary, and bury each of them in turn. Grief did not shape him. Silence did. By the time he inherited the throne of Spain, he already ruled over Spain's Italian possessions, the Low Countries' vast swaths of the Americas and the Philippines, named for him while he was still a prince. His was an empire built on silver blood and faith. He ruled from El Escorial, a vast cold monastery palace he had constructed outside Madrid, part royal residence, part mausoleum. Every corridor whispered mortality. Power for Philip was not pleasure. It was duty. And duty meant suffering. He worked relentlessly alone, locked in his study for 16 hours a day, reading dispatches by candlelight, answering reports in his own hand. Ministers feared his scrutiny. Ambassadors dreaded his silences. Even his confessor once admitted, "He confesses everything, except what he truly feels." And then came the cracks. The Dutch rebelled. The English sent pirates and flame. The Ottomans threatened the seas. The French undermined him. The Protestants defied him. And through it all, Philip tried to hold the empire together with sheer force of will, even as his body began to collapse. The first signs were small pain in the legs, stiffness in the joints. But gout was more than just discomfort. It crippled him. Soon he could no longer walk unassisted. His fingers swelled grotesquely. His sleep became torment. He refused treatment not out of pride, but penance. Pain was part of God's plan, he believed. To suffer was to be holy. But pain doesn't sanctify. It destroys. Over time, his illnesses multiplied. His kidneys began to fail. His body swelled with fluid. His skin broke down. He developed fevers, infections, ulcers that would not close. Surgeons cut and drained. Priests prayed. Nothing worked. And yet he clung to the throne, held court from his bed, dictated letters from between fits of delirium. Witnesses described the smell from his chambers as unholy. The linens had to be changed several times a day, soaked through with blood and pus. The wounds on his legs became cavernous. Maggots were found in the bandages. He was no longer just sick. He was rotting. And still he ruled. When ambassadors arrived, he had them brought to his bedside. He greeted them with blackened lips and a skeletal smile. His body was devoured, but his mind remained sharp until even that began to slip. They say he had visions in those final weeks, that he saw his dead wife, his dead son, his enemies laughing in fire, that he begged his confessors to let him die. But each time they urged him to endure, to suffer in Christ's name, to lead by example even into agony. And so, he endured. A king once feared across the world, now whimpering in a room that reeked of death, bound not by chains, but by devotion to God, to crown to the idea that suffering was holy. But behind the walls of El Escorial, no angel came, only rot. El Escorial was never meant to be a home. It was a monument carved from gray granite stone and silent, towering over the hills outside Madrid. Philip II had built it not for comfort, but for eternity. Half palace, half monastery, part funeral vault. It was his answer to the chaos of the world, a fortress for faith, a tomb for kings, and in the end, it became his prison. Here amid freezing halls and echoing stone, Philip spent the last years of his life not just dying, but preparing to die. He surrounded himself with relics, monks, and symbols of suffering. He read accounts of martyrdom before bed. He demanded his meals be simple, his clothes plain. He forbade music. Even his portraits showed him gaunt pale, withdrawn, a king more dead than alive. This was not humility. It was control. Philip did not fear death. He feared judgment. and so he crafted his own martyrdom, a final performance of suffering played out before God, his court, and history itself. He would not die like a man. He would die like a saint. But sainthood came at a terrible cost. His refusal to be treated to allow comfort, rest, or relief turned pain into policy. Every ulcer, every fever, every scream from his bed became part of his design. His doctors pleaded. His confessors hesitated. His family watched in silent horror. But no one dared defy him. Even in decay, he was still the king. By the summer of 1598, Philip was more wound than man. He had not walked in months. His bones jutted through his skin. His eyes were yellowed and sunken. His legs were bandaged in layers that bled through before noon. His bedsheets stuck to his body, when changed peeling skin with them. He refused morphine. He refused wine. He asked instead for thorns and pressed them into his palms. And still he worked. One letter survives from these final weeks, written in a shaking hand, smeared with blood. In it, he details troop movements in the Netherlands and advises caution in dealing with France. The handwriting is barely legible, but the signature Yo el Rey is firm. I, the king. Even as his organs shut down, he was still fighting the ghosts of rebellion and heresy, still believing his suffering was part of a divine war, not just for his soul, but for all of Christendom. But beneath the piety was a deep, unspoken terror that everything he had built might crumble the moment he was gone. His heir, Philip III, was weak. The empire was drowning in debt. Rebellions simmered. Enemies circled like vultures. And Spain, that glorious empire of faith and conquest, was beginning to rot, just as its king had. On August 31st, 1598, the end came. He asked to be laid on a bed of ash. He asked for a crucifix to be nailed to the wall before him. He asked to die, facing it. He was in so much pain by then, he could barely speak. Only whispers came from his lips. Prayers, apologies, cries to Christ. At his side stood his children, his priests, and the nobles of Spain. No music played. No banners waved. The palace was silent, except for the wet, ragged sound of the king's breath. When it stopped, no one moved. The silence stretched long enough for the monks to wonder if the soul had truly left. Long enough for the courtiers to doubt what they had witnessed. A man so powerful, so absolute, reduced to a corpse, naked beneath a blood-stained sheet. At that moment, the weight of the world shifted, and no one knew where it would fall. They embalmed him in secret. They dressed him in royal silks. They hid the wounds, the rot, the stench. They paraded his body through the streets of Madrid as if he had died peacefully, as if holiness had preserved him. Portraits painted him serene, beatific, a saint king, a martyr of Christendom. But that was the lie. The truth lay buried in the stone vaults beneath El Escorial, in the stained linens burned at dawn, in the terrified eyes of those who had watched him die, in the memory of a man who mistook agony for glory. Philip II died not as a martyr. He died as a prisoner of his own faith. But the story is not over. Because long after his death, the empire he ruled, the empire he tried to save with pain, and fire began to fall apart, not in war, but in silence. The king was dead, but the shadow he cast remained long cold and impossible to ignore. Philip II had once ruled more land than any monarch in history. His word had shaken continents. But death is the great equalizer. And when his body was lowered into the crypt beneath El Escorial, encased in marble, surrounded by incense and prayers, something else was being buried with him, the illusion of control. In the weeks after his death, Spain entered a kind of stunned silence. His son Philip III ascended the throne, timid, indecisive, and utterly unprepared. Unlike his father, he had no appetite for the long hours, the heavy decisions, the weight of empire. He handed power to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, and retreated into luxury. The throne had passed on. but the fire that had fueled it had died. The cracks widened. Philip II had kept the empire together through fierce bureaucracy and sheer will. He had micromanaged everything from war budgets to the wording of religious edicts. Now suddenly, no one was watching. No one was listening. The machine he had built kept turning, but without purpose. And slowly, silently, Spain began to decline. Not all at once. It started with whispers, rumors of corruption, of money vanishing into the hands of favorites of military officers left unpaid. Silver from the Americas still flowed in, but debts drained it faster than it could arrive. Inflation soared. Starvation spread. The people who had once praised their Catholic king now cursed the taxes that buried them. Abroad, Spain's enemies stirred. England, emboldened by Philip's failure to conquer it, expanded its power at sea. The Dutch, no longer intimidated, pushed for full independence. Even the French, long Catholic rivals, sensed opportunity. The empire was still vast, still gilded with gold and ritual, but the rot had begun. The body still breathed, but it was infected, just like its king had been. Historians today debate when the Spanish Empire truly began to fall. Some say it was the defeat of the Armada. Others say it was the bankruptcy declarations. But perhaps the real moment was quieter, the moment Philip II died, and no one knew how to rule without him. Because in truth, Philip had not prepared a legacy. He had only prepared for judgment. He had not taught his son how to govern, only how to obey. He had not built institutions, only chains. He had not created strength, only silence. The empire he left behind was vast in land, but hollow in spirit. It had no heart, no voice, no soul beyond the crown. And now that crown sat on a head too weak to wear it. The irony is sharp. Philip II had spent his final years convinced that his agony served a divine purpose, that by suffering, he was protecting his people, his faith, his legacy. But in reality, his pain had saved nothing. It had only delayed the inevitable decline not of armies, but of vision, not of might, but of meaning. He had mistaken control for power, obedience for loyalty, fear for faith, and like his own decaying body, the empire followed, beautiful on the outside, collapsing within. Today, El Escorial still stands. Tourists walk its long corridors, admire its paintings, marvel at its architecture. Few realize that beneath their feet lie the bones of kings, and among those bones, black and brittle, and wrapped in royal silk, rests the man who tried to hold the world together with suffering. Philip II did not die a martyr. He died a warning. History is a kind liar. It prefers triumphs to failures. It records coronations, not bedsores, battles, not boils, the glory of empire, not the stink of a dying man screaming in the dark. And so Philip II, King of Spain, ruler of half the known world, is remembered not as a ruin, but as a symbol, a monument, a titan of Catholic faith and royal duty, the man who built El Escorial, the architect of empire. But the truth is harder, and far more human. He died in agony, not the quick agony of war or even the noble decay of old age, but the slow, humiliating collapse of a body consumed from within. A death that stripped him not only of dignity, but of meaning. A king who tried to become a saint and ended as a ghost. Why does this matter? Because Philip's death was not just a personal horror. It was a mirror held to power itself. It revealed the rot beneath the robes, the blood beneath the blessing, the silence behind the crown. His body failed in the same way all empires do, slowly, then suddenly. Not from weakness, but from denial. He thought he could outpray disease, outsuffer failure. He believed that willpower and faith could hold a crumbling world together. And for a time, they did. But in the end, flesh wins. Time wins, pain wins, and yet perhaps that's what makes his story so haunting. Not because he died in pain, but because he chose it, Not because he failed, but because he couldn't admit it. Even as he bled, even as he screamed, he clung to the rituals, the routines, the idea that suffering itself was strength. That kingship required agony. That salvation must be earned drop by drop, wound by wound. And in doing so, he taught those around him and the empire that followed to fear comfort, to worship silence, and to mistake control for righteousness. That legacy outlived him. For generations, Spain would echo his shadows, secretive, rigid, obsessed with orthodoxy, terrified of change. The empire limped on conquering, converting, decaying, until finally, the weight of history broke its spine. By the 19th century, it had lost nearly all its colonies. The world it once ruled had moved on, but El Escorial still stands, cold, majestic, funereal. A mausoleum not just for Philip, but for everything he believed. There beneath layers of stone, in a vault known as El Pudridero, the rotting room, the bodies of Spanish monarchs were left to decay before being placed in their golden tombs. Philip II's remains rested there for years, blackened, silent, still. And maybe that's fitting, because for all his titles, all his triumphs, all his tortured prayers, he was never truly at peace. Not in life, not in death. He was a man who tried to turn pain into holiness and found only rot. So the next time you hear the word empire, remember the ulcers. Remember the screams behind velvet curtains. Remember the king who begged for death and was denied. Not every throne is made of gold. Some are built of ash.